With that, I'm gonna switch over if we're good. So we'll head over to segment 6. And what segment 6 is about is a pretty common issue in at least how I have seen people use Medicaid data. It's something I've had to deal with. The issue of how the construct of disenrollment from Medicaid, and also what that does to what we can know, and how we deal with it. Continuous enrollment is a common, kind of data cleaning step with claims. People will apply this so that they don't have censored months. They might do it because they want to make sure that a person has gotten the full benefit of the program. They might do it for many reasons. But what it means is that your data end up looking fairly clean. So, the top row of 12 continuous months is a very common thing, or 6 continuous months. So people do this all the time. And again, you could do it for many reasons. It could be for data cleanliness, if that's what you're looking for. People might want to make sure somebody gets a full dose of a program. You might need sufficient data to capture sufficient events or key covariates. And you just want to make sure that you got all the complete information there to do that. One thing that I would also just suggest is that, you could look at continuous enrollment or non-continuous enrollment as a topic of interest in its own right. With Medicaid, there's an added wrinkle, and that's because Medicaid does have a lot of churn or change in coverage. And in Medicaid, the sources that I have read indicate that, most often churn is change from an enrolled status in Medicaid to no coverage, not necessarily getting it could be new employment and other things, but there is a very common reason which is just somebody loses their coverage for some reason. Wasn't able to re-enroll at the correct time, enrollment in a particular state, they couldn't navigate it. There could be a lot of reasons, but a person might just become disenrolled. So there could be some cases where somebody's not in the Medicaid program enrollment, and they did get a new, employer-based insurance, and that's completely a possibility. We just want to note that the most common change is often to no coverage. So in addition, the variations in program administration and retroactive coverage kind of add additional complexity in how we understand the censoring that happens as a result of people dropping out of our enrollment data. And if you want to kind of compare this to Medicare, to a much lesser degree to private, or employer-sponsored insurance, we use Medicare. The application of a 12-month continuous enrollment period, depending on whether you're dealing with new enrollees or anything in Medicare, a lot of times you don't necessarily lose a lot of people. Continuous enrollment is pretty common in Medicare. So if you compare that case with Medicare to what we see in Medicaid, it just becomes more complex with the existence of the problem, and again, what kinds of things we try to do about it. So instead of those kind of like nice clean lines at the top of 12 months or 6 months, you might see, and this is in my experience, we had a program where supposedly the default was that somebody was enrolled for 6 months. But when we actually looked in the data, we found that people might be enrolled for 2 or 3 months and then drop off and then come back 6 months later. Now, could that be that they had an acute event 6 months later and were then retroactively enrolled for 3 months and then dropped off? It's really hard to say, but if you talk to an administrator of the program, they might assume that these enrollment patterns are much more like the top two, whereas when you actually get into the data, you may find that they look much more like the bottom two. And so what happens in between those months of coverage of enrollment is a question that you should at least grapple with within your own particular use case or your own particular study. What I typically see, because it is a messy problem and it's a lot of times easier just to cut the messy problem out, what I typically see are, I've just pulled these phrases from various studies. Medicaid patients aged less than 18 years with 12 months of continuous enrollment, or at least 180 days of continuous enrollment, required to have continuous enrollment for the observation period. Some X month period of continuous enrollment was required. Over and over again, this is typically what I see. And that's not to say that this is the wrong approach. The one reason why we wanted to put this into this segment into this workshop today is because we want people to at least consider that there are other approaches, or to consider what this does for the conclusions that you take away, and how you run, the choices of that you make in your analysis plan and other things. Just make sure to think about, like, what would the implications be if you apply this type of a restriction, especially when you consider the fact that this could have impacts on a lot of different, on the mix of variables that's in your study, and not just kind of one thing. So considerations when you're thinking about applying these types of restrictions, a 6-month continuous or a 12-month continuous, like that. Do you look at monthly enrollment? So are you looking at enrollment days? If you're using those measures, do you use the monthly eligibility or restricted benefit codes? Do you include those? Do you count them as being enrolled? And what do you do about managed care? What if somebody moves from fee-for-service to managed care or back? Those kinds of things. So when we say continuous enrollment, we actually need to problematize that and define it carefully, and think again about what that's going to do for the sample the analytic sample that you end up with, and how closely that aligns with the conclusions you want to make about the overall Medicaid program or the Medicaid program in a given state, and so on. We just pulled a few states. There is no particular political or other reason for these particular states. I kind of forget why we chose them. But, so to start with the left, we have Colorado. You can see that, fairly large differences in size between a couple. So starting with the farthest left column, to look at the overall effect, we're looking at people who had at least 1 month of enrollment between 2014, including 2014 to 2016. We are excluding out of this analysis anybody who has missing eligibility information, which, as you saw, does happen. But so you get, 1.9, 5.8, and 4.6 million people with at least 1 month over that period. If you then require a period of 12 months of consecutive enrollment across that period, so sometime during that period, that person had to have 12 months of continuous or consecutive enrollment. You can see you lose, not tiny percentages of people when you do that. And we'll also look at the shape of what that does to your analytic sample as well in terms of people's characteristics. Now you'll note though that if you do that, the people who remain, if they had 12 months of continuous enrollment, a lot of times the mean months enrolled for the group was actually near the full period. So if you can get people who have 12 months, a lot of them may be likely to have the whole period enrolled. All right. So that's one way that you could restrict. Now, the other thing to think about is, okay, what if we just limited that to 6 months? And of course, we lose a fair number fewer people, but we still do lose, around up to and around 10% of the potential analytic sample when we apply that particular criteria. One thing though that we want to think about is that maybe you've just requested a single calendar year, or you're requiring your continuous enrollment period in a calendar year. So instead of a 3-year window where you got 2014, 15, 2016, or 2-year period, sorry, from there, we have now the number with any enrollment just for that year, right? So we got 1.6, 5.1, 3.7 million. So any enrollment, any month of enrollment during the year. When you require people to have all 12 months, you do drop a fair amount of people, getting up to, a quarter to 30% of people that are lost if you're doing this within one single calendar year. But one thing that I think is important to make a note here is that you're not just losing people randomly, and it's going to depend on the state. So it's non-random typically, but it also, that non-randomness and the bias that's introduced in your sample is also, it's going to vary a lot by states. So looking across these 3 states, when we apply the 12 months continuous enrollment in Colorado, well, to begin with, virtually everybody had US citizenship. And so if we're looking at immigration status, for instance, we, by and large, at least percentage-wise, we're not necessarily changing our sample that much. But when you look at Florida, for instance, qualified non-citizens in the any enrollment sample is, a good, say 15 or 16% of the potential sample. But when we apply our 12 months of continuous enrollment, that drops to like 5%. And similarly in Illinois, you get, again, variable effects across states. And so when we apply this type of a continuous enrollment constraint or criterion, you are going to see this variation, and it's not easy to say, well, it's going to hit this group or that group. Again, the answer is going to also include, and it depends on the state. And so if you have a set of states where you're making a comparison by evaluating a program, for instance, you might want to pay attention to the degree to which this type of criterion is going to impact or bias your potential sample. Another variable here is race and ethnicity. So again, it's going to vary by state. By applying it in one state, we see a higher proportion of white non-Hispanic individuals in the 12 months of continuous enrollment. And we see some of the other groups shrink a fair amount. In Illinois, we have a different change. So the idea that it biases in a particular direction that we can then easily model away isn't necessarily the case. And so we just want to kind of pay attention to the fact that this type of restriction is going to play out differently across states because of a lot of different reasons that we've already talked about today. One more example. Now, these don't add up to 100%. We took a few categories of eligibility. And again, looking across just in 2016, this 12-month continuous enrollment, where the percent of people who are missing their eligibility information, we left them in this sample. The percent of people who are missing do drop. And if you were going to exclude them anyway, maybe that's okay with you. But we also see that the proportion, for instance, of infants and children under age 19, and we're not talking about those medically needy, gets larger. The ones who medically needy children under age 18 also gets larger. And then we do lose some categories. Some of the other categories that we excluded here also shrank to make up for some of that difference. And so you can just kind of see that even the eligibility categories are going to differ you're essentially changing the shape of your population or your analytic sample when you do this. And so the degree to which that is a good representation of the population you're trying to represent is kind of going to be an open question. And so it's good to just kind of pay attention to, for instance, demographic data quality as an example. But also you might want to think about what would it look like if we apply this, a 12 or 6 month continuous enrollment period across the states that you happen to be looking at. So possible approaches, certainly people just clean the data by applying that particular criterion, but just to throw out there that, this is a censoring issue. And so there are a lot of different approaches to censoring and missing data that are possible. And again, we're not endorsing any particular one or saying that, that requiring the 12 or 6 month criterion is wrong. It's just that it seems to be by far the most common method. And there are methods. I've used a number of these that you can apply weights to address bias from non-random censoring. You can use multiple imputation with pattern mixture model variations so that you're kind of setting some plausible assumptions rather than just letting models operate. We have various forms of other imputation. So multiple imputation, use of unknown categories and certain categorical variables, although that has a methodological literature around it, and various other approaches. There also, of course, is just analyzing the patterns of unenrolled months as a topic in and of itself. So many or most of these do rely on observed data to inform, adjust, or impute for unobserved values. So if you know anything about missing data theory, you know that that might carry some of its own problems. In practice, what some teams that I have worked with have done have included censoring weights, for instance. And when we compared censoring weights to an analysis that applied a 6-month criterion, we actually found very similar estimates and inference. And so it seemed like the censoring weights were working in that particular case. And of course, every other project is going to have its own needs. But just put out there that there are a number of other approaches that people can use, and that the exclusion, just to note that in the literature, that is probably the most common thing that we've seen. It's just not the only choice, and it does create potential bias in your analytic sample. So the takeaways are that unenrolled months do censor people out of the data. With retroactive enrollment, we might hope we are still capturing those with services. So maybe retroactive enrollment really does allow us to really capture the services that people need and that they get, that things don't fall into charity care, uncompensated care that don't make it into the Medicaid data, but we don't necessarily know. And so by censoring that out and either leaving the censoring there and just running it on the complete sample, or removing people, those can create bias in either the sample or the estimates. In addition, existing approaches can get very advanced, but they don't necessarily let us kind of peek through the data to see what's really happening. So all of these approaches make certain assumptions. And so, as always, we kind of recommend like a case-by-case basis, considering sensitivity analysis and so on, without necessarily endorsing any one particular approach. We also would say that it's good to just ascertain the completeness of the data as early as possible, so that you can know whether the data are going to be suitable for helping you answer your question. And that's not just necessarily, are these variables available in this particular year, but also, do we have a large degree of censoring in a particular year due to some particular, contextual issue. I'm not sure how we're doing for time. I think we're okay. Are there any questions?
Some questions in the chat. The first one might be more of a statement, but someone noted that some populations, like those with disabilities, might have more stable enrollment patterns. I think you alluded to that. And then I think maybe this could be the whole discussion, or it could be a huge discussion. How do we consider the impact of generalizability of outcomes if we do enact strict continuous enrollment criteria that cause beneficiaries to drop out?
And that's kind of, that's why we felt that it was important to bring up the issue, so that it's one of the questions that researchers consider. To the previous point, for instance, if you're working with a population that actually does have pretty good continuous enrollment, I'll give another example. So there are people who might be in due to disability. Also, certain populations of older adults. I'm working on a project right now that's looking at people in nursing facilities, and using the Medicaid data, talking to our analyst, I said, well, is censoring an issue? And he said, well, in this particular population, we're actually not concerned about it. It's really not as big of an issue. So it might be that you don't necessarily have to worry about generalizability, because a good proportion of your people do have large chunks of continuous enrollment, and so it may not create an issue. So it is really a case-by-case basis, a population-by-population basis in some cases. Yes, there is. This is the primary trade-off: is if we apply strict or moderate continuous enrollment criteria, then we want to think about what does that do to the underlying analytic sample, and how does it shape it away. If it does, how does it shape it away from the underlying population of interest, right? And we're balancing that against all of the assumptions that are made by any other approach we might take, which, a number of those assumptions may not be very tenable. So you might, for instance, if you're using a particular approach that assumes that the data are missing at random, meaning once we account for observed data, we assume that otherwise the data are conditionally random, and so we can address it with observable data. A lot of approaches to missing data assume that. If you assume, however, that people might actually be missing for something that we don't have a good measure for, that's non-ignorable missing, for instance, or missing not at random, then you need to start thinking about what are the approaches that are supposed to address that, and what are the kinds of workarounds that you can do, and do you even feel comfortable kind of answering this question, knowing that that could be the case. And so again, depending on the project, the possibility of missing not at random might be very large. And if you feel really uncomfortable making the assumptions of using the approaches that would address it, again, it may just be kind of a very cautious approach and say, maybe this isn't the right data source or time frame or state or whatever else that happens to be the answer. So I do think there's always that trade-off, given that disenrollment is just a thing in Medicaid. Is just that kind of bias versus, are you creating other forms of bias through any other approach that you might choose?
Great, thank you. The next question is, do infants born to mothers on Medicaid usually have enrollment starting the date of their delivery or earlier?
That's a good question. I don't have a good straight answer for you. I think it's going to depend on state, depending on how states enroll people who give birth. And so I know that, so for instance, in some project on out-of-home placement in a particular county in Minnesota, we found that, yeah, there are plenty of children who were enrolled in Medicaid prior to birth, but it's a variable, meaning it's not 100%. And so my guess would be that there are going to be plenty of, and again, it's going to depend on how the program is administered in the state as much as any particular policy. And so I think it's going to be, that's a fairly open question. I don't have a good answer to it. I do think it's going to vary by state quite a bit. Like I said, I know that in Minnesota, it varies. There are going to be some children who are at least on file as having been enrolled prior to birth. And then there are some children who may be enrolled on the day of birth or those kinds of things. Retroactive eligibility could be a part of that story. But that particular, I don't have a good data point to give you on it.
Yeah, there's a resource in the DQ Atlas actually on
yeah, good.
Medicaid ID that's shared between mother and infants. And I mean, that's not a perfect answer either, but it does point to, there are quite a few states where Medicaid or mothers and newborns will share their MSIS ID in the state MSIS data. So we can point to some resources for those, or to that resource. Another question was, how do you handle a situation where a beneficiary is shown to be enrolled in 2 or more locations, possibly even different states?
Well, depending on, I guess it would depend on the time frame. If we're saying, their enrollment periods actually overlap, as opposed to, say, in a given same month, where you could imagine a case where their enrollment ends in one state or starts in another, something like that. So it would depend on the time period. I would also say that you'd want to, so there are some problems, at least in Medicare, I don't know if there are a lot of them in Medicaid, where when you actually look at the number of people that are reflected by a particular case like that, the percentage or overall number of people may not be very big. And so then you have this kind of open question of, okay, do I make a judgment call and include them in one or the other? Do I, for my particular, do I need to locate them in one state only? Do I assume that they are, that those data are that the person's representation in the data is flawed in some way? So it's going to depend, I think, on the particular use case. I could see a couple of ways in which it could happen, but it also could be, it could be that, their retroactive eligibility put them back into a period where they were technically living in another state or something like that. So those would be the kinds of things that I would ask. But I don't think I have a good, here's exactly what you do in that case.
Thanks. Someone asked if a person is missing enrollment data for an entire year, but has claims observed throughout the year, is there a way to work backwards and determine their enrollment by month using the utilization data?
To figure out enrollment by month. I mean, if a person that I don't think so, just for the simple fact that, you know, need doesn't equal utilization, right? Yeah, I don't know that you could actually work back. I mean, you could say, okay, they have utilization in the records at this time point and at this time point. Can I say anything about what their true enrollment is during that period or any other time outside of it? I'm not aware of a way that you could do that. Yeah, and again, then it becomes judgment calls like so many things in methods, right? So then it's, do I say, hey, I'm going to count them as enrolled in months that they have in utilization, or I'm going to count them as enrolled from the months, you know, across the range of months that are marked by those utilization events, those kinds of things. Yeah, I don't know that you could work back with certainty. You could work back and develop your own kind of workaround. I don't know that you could do it with certainty.
Okay, I think this is an interesting question. If we're looking at something like in the DQ Atlas that is assessing data quality, could these data quality metrics be a function of state level disenrollment severity or enrollment patterns?
I mean, I would say yes. You could, I mean, could it be? Yes, absolutely. Could it be? Could be. Is it necessarily, you know, is that the primary, is it primarily a function of state disenrollment rates or state enrollment policies or anything? That I don't know that we could say. I think you'd have to, you know, try to correlate that to really make that statement. And I'm not sure that I've seen any empirical work that does that. I suppose that's a paper somebody could do.
Okay, this might be the last question. I'm not sure. People could still hop in, but someone asked if you could explain the difference between eligibility and enrollment variables in TAF data.
Yeah, so enrollment would be the person is enrolled in the program. Eligibility data would, I mean, at least the ones I'm thinking of when I say eligibility are, you know, reasons for eligibility. So in the same way you have in Medicare data, if you have programs where, you know, you've got people could be eligible due to old age, due to, you know, disability status, end-stage renal disease, or amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, right? So we got 4 eligibility categories, and we have an indicator in Medicare to do that. So when we're talking about eligibility data here, it would be the same kind of information. You know, is this person a parent, you know, a low-income parent? Is this, are these medically needy children? Those types of things. Because again, eligibility in Medicaid is not quite as well. For instance, old age eligibility is such a common reason for eligibility. But beyond that, there aren't really any other criteria we apply when somebody hits that age. That's it. We have a lot of, typically, we often have a lot of criteria that we might apply or could potentially, that states could potentially apply when they are determining eligibility and when people enroll. And so when I say eligibility, usually I'm talking about the types of information that indicate the reason for eligibility. So one is this person's enrolled, say in a given month. The other is here's the reason that they're eligible.